Hello and welcome to a new UiPath demo. In this video, we'll learn how to work with queues in Orchestrator. We'll start by creating a queue in Orchestrator, populating it with data using an automation, typically called dispatcher, and then we'll consume the transactions in the queue using another automation. This one is typically called performer. Queues are extremely important for large-scale automation projects. They allow the storage and processing of basically unlimited amounts of data, provided that the data can be organized in transactions. Queues offer a lot of flexibility by accommodating different data types. And they're a perfect fit for cases in which data is taken from different channels, standardized, and then used as an input for other applications, like ERP or CRM. For this example, we created an Excel file with 3 columns: sender, receiver, and points. We'll build an automation project to process each row as a transactional item in a queue. Then another automation will take each transaction and add the data to the points tracker form web page. The first 3 fields on the web page correspond to the columns sender, receiver, and points. But we have a 4th one, ID. This one is meant to secure our transaction using an SHA-256 hash function. We're using this online hash generator here. We're inputting the data in this format and generating the hash. And then this goes into the 4th field on the web page. Once the fields are filled in, we're clicking Submit. What we have here is a classic scenario in which a queue is the best option, ensuring flexibility, optimal resource allocation, and security. Now, let's automate. We'll start in Orchestrator by creating a new queue. Queues are folder entities, so they have to be created inside them. We're here in the root folder. We'll go to Queues and click the plus sign. We'll give it a name and add a short description. Now, there are several options here to configure the queue, such as unique reference, which prevents having duplicate transactions, and auto retry function for when exceptions are thrown. We'll leave them as they were. Queues are created empty by default and without a specific data schema. If you need them to have a specific schema, you can use JSON structures. Finally, we can also set up SLA predictions by enabling the SLA. But for now, we'll leave this to off. Once we set up all of our details, we can click Add. And here is our new queue, containing the description and details such as in progress and remaining items, average completion time per item, successfully processed items, application and business exceptions, and processes. We can also view more options for our newly created queue from the 3-dotted menu. Among others, we can edit the queue, add triggers, monitor the queue, or upload items. Alright, the queue is ready, so it's time to build the automations. We already created 2 empty processes for this demo, the performer and the dispatcher. Let's open the dispatcher and start adding activities. Once again, our dispatcher will read the Excel file and use each row in the table as a transactional item. So it will populate the queue. To do that, we'll start with an Excel application scope and select the Excel file containing the data. Next, we'll add a read range activity and specify the name of the sheet with the data. We'll also need an output variable for the data that we're reading. Let's call it DT points tracker. Now, the easiest way to add the items to the queue from our file is to use the Resources panel. Let's open it and hit Refresh. And there's our queue. If we drag and drop it into our workflow, we'll get this selection of activities that use queues. The one that we're interested in is bulk add queue items, which does exactly what the title says. It adds the items to the queue in bulk. The queue name is pre-filled in the dedicated field. The only thing that we're left to do is to add the source for the data, which is the DT points tracker. Let's run the process and see how it works. Okay, now if we go to the queues page and click refresh, we can see that we have 99 remaining items. So, all of the rows in the input file are now here in the queue as 99 transactions. If we click View Transactions, we're able to see each of them. By accessing View Details, we can also see the content of each item. Great, now let's take care of the performer. This one will consume the queue. More specifically, it will take a transactional item, input the corresponding data onto the web page, including the ID. This one will be obtained from the hash generator. So, we'll open the performer process that we created and start configuring it. Let's drag and drop the queue to our workflow once more, but this time select Get Transaction Item. The queue name is populated, and we'll just need to create a variable to store the queue item data. Let's call it Transaction Item. This will be of a special data type called queue item. Having a specific data type accommodates different data schemas without too much data manipulation done up front. Next, let's add an open browser activity where we'll add the URL of the web page where we'll input the data and select Internet Explorer as the browser used. To input the data in each field, we'll be using Type Into activities. Let's start with 1, indicate the sender field, and rename the activity to Type Sender. To input the right piece of data, namely the sender, we have several options. One of the easiest ones is to use the specific content method applied to the transaction item variable. In the expression editor, it goes like this: transaction item dot specific content of sender between quotation marks to string. Let's use simulate type method for this activity. This should improve the speed and the reliability. And everything looks good. We have 3 more fields to input to, so let's add 3 more type into activities and indicate their corresponding fields. We'll also rename each activity. The first 2 type into activities are very similar to the first one. We'll use the same expression and just change the name of the field to receiver and points, respectively. But for the 4th type into, we need to get the hash and only then input it into the ID field. So, let's add an open browser activity that points to the hash generator. Once again, let's use Internet Explorer. Now we need a type into for the input data. Let's add it inside the open browser that we've just added and indicate the field from the SHA-256 generator. This one. Let's also rename the activity to type data for ID. OK, here we need to input the sender name, the receiver name, and the points separated by a slash. Let's expand the expression editor and build the expression. It will start with transaction item dot specific content of sender between quotation marks dot string plus the slash character between quotation marks. Then we'll add the similar expression for receiver, followed by another slash. And finally, the points. So, this expression will be entered in the input field of the hash generator, and it will display the hash, which we then need to extract. We'll use a getText activity for this purpose, which we'll rename to getID. To make it work, we'll need a new variable. Let's call it ID. Let's also change its scope to the sequence, as we'll use it outside of the open browser. Now we have what it takes for our last type into, the data in this ID variable. Let's make sure that everything runs smoothly by updating the input method to simulate for all of our type into activities. We can also add a close tab activity after the hash is generated. Then we'll add a click activity that clicks on the Submit button of the Points Tracker web page. Rename it and change the input method to Simulate. Working with queues and transactions requires making sure that we aren't processing the same item more than once. For this, we need to update the status of the transaction item. And there's a really easy way of doing it with the setTransaction status activity. We need to input the transaction item. As for the status, it's pre-filled as successful. We'll leave it like this, but it is worth noting that we could change it from the properties. Check the official Orchestrator documentation to see all of the transaction item statuses. One last thing, let's make sure that the tab is closed. We'll add a close tab activity before the setTransaction status. And now the performer workflow looks good. We'll save it and then publish it to Orchestrator. Successful. Now let's see how this works. We'll first go to Orchestrator, Automations, and create a new process. Let's select the performer package that we've just published. All we need to do now is to start some jobs. From the Jobs tab, we'll hit the Start button, select our previously created process, and make it run twice. So we'll have 2 jobs. We have 2 users, basically 2 robots, and 2 machines with unattended runtimes. If we leave both fields to any, the jobs will be done by the robot as soon as they become free. Let's click Start and see what happens. One of them is already running. But let's also open our virtual machines. It seems that each of the 2 robots are taking care of one job on each of the machines. And the runs are now completed. Let's check them in Orchestrator. Under Job Details, we can see that they were completed indeed, plus some extra details. And if we go to our queue, we can see that 2 items were successfully processed with an average time of 7 seconds. And with this, we've reached the end of the Working with Queues demo. In the next video, we'll check out some interesting options for consuming queues and monitoring them. Stay tuned.